Welcome back to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director at Denison Forum. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. Sitting down today with my friend, John Mark Caton, who is pastor of Cottonwood Creek Church in the Dallas area, pastor there for 27 years. John Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you.
Glad to have you, and thank you for stepping in for a very important but challenging conversation we want to talk about here in the month of September, which is Suicide Prevention Month. I want to say this a number of times through this podcast. Just recently, over the summer, they created a new phone number for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, 988, just like you call 911 for help. If you need help talking to somebody because you're discouraged, you're depressed, there is a new number. All you have to remember is 988 will connect you to the National Suicide Hotline. If you need to talk with somebody, it's great to talk to a pastor, family member, friend. But if you don't feel like you have anybody else to talk to, you can call 988. John Mark, you wrote a book about your experience with suicide. We've both been pastors for 30 plus years. I don't know about you, but in my churches, I had people, fortunately not on a lot of occasions, but 2 or 3, 4, 5, either people in a certain situation threatened suicide. I actually had a couple of occasions where a family member of somebody in my church actually committed suicide and tried to walk with families through that. But that wasn't what triggered this in terms of writing this book. But talk about it first pastorally, and then talk about what your story is personally as it relates to dealing with suicide.
Yeah, sure, Mark, thanks. And as a pastor, this is one of those things that just as you had many times, I would walk with families through maybe the loss of a loved one, or, I would encounter someone who's now a member of my church, but they're struggling. Maybe their mom or their dad took their lives in previous years, and it's still kind of a burden or struggle. And so pastorally, it was very easy for me to answer some of those questions about, can they still be saved? Can someone commit suicide? And that was always the number one question. Can someone commit suicide and still go to heaven?
Right.
And so pastorally, it was easy to answer those questions. Biblically, it was easy to answer those questions. And certainly I could pray with someone and encourage them through. And I would talk about some of the biblical illustrations of people who would struggle. And then there would be times, just as you would experience, in my church, that someone, at least in my early experience in ministry, it was typically men who were going through some deep difficulty or struggling with some amazing addiction, that they were to the place where they would voice or verbalize, I am contemplating committing suicide. And I could pray with them and walk them through those circumstances and issues. And so I think from a biblical and pastoral side, I was able to navigate the journey relatively well. But it was when it became personal that it literally about took me out of the ministry.
Yeah, and that's where it really changes, is what the depth of your proximity to it becomes, right? And so me and my wife are dealing with this right now. Just in the last 2 weeks, we had a friend of ours that we've known basically for 40 years, a man later in life, and as we've talked about it, me and some of my friends that knew this person, so we've talked about it. If we were making a list of people we thought might get that to that kind of a dark place, he would have been the last person on this list. And don't know all the circumstances because I haven't been able to interact with him deeply in the last number of years, but he was very much a part of our life when we were teenagers and when we were starting out as married couples, and just one of the most joyful, faithful, reliable churchmen we have ever met. I mean, just always full of joy and served people in consistent ways, and just got overwhelmed in the last couple of weeks, and just been really hard to walk through that with not only my wife, but with a bunch of people that knew him. And so, we'll get to this in a minute, talking about the rising rates of suicide among younger people, but it's also, as you said, even men in their older years, get into circumstances where they just lose all their hope. But what is your personal connection to this over the last couple of years? Yeah,
my personal connection was several years back. I had an older brother who had been through a number of things in life that like all of us, none of us are perfect, but he went through a divorce, lived out in there are key indicators here. Not all of them do we see in such a clear fashion, but he had gone through a divorce. He'd married the love of his life. They'd moved out in the country, so they were out in the country where they wanted to be. Then they went through a divorce. She left, and my brother stayed in the country. Well, isolated and alone is not good. When you add another contributing factor for him was he was an alcoholic. And he was the kind of alcoholic that could go 6, 7, 8 months, 12 months without touching a drop. But when he would fall off the wagon, he fell off the wagon hard. And oftentimes it would, the people he worked with would work with him and just call it vacation and stuff because he was a great employee. But there came a point when all the cards just came crashing down, that he had lost his marriage, he lived alone, didn't have any friends, had one of his drinking spells, and then he lost a job. So everything he had was gone.
There's a compounding effect.
Absolutely, compounding effect. Yeah. And here's where it became very personal to me, which took me out. And the book is called Last Call, An Unfinished Life, because one of the things he did was call me to tell me goodbye. And I can still to this day remember being at the church, walking out after one of these perpetual church meetings that last till midnight that we
Pastors
both been a part of.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And back in those days, I would leave my phone in my truck, and I opened my phone up, and I missed all these calls from my brother, and I called him back late at night, and he just was real honest with me. He said, I'm just about to take my life. I wanted to call and tell you I love you and goodbye.
Wow.
And ask for you to forgive me.
Yeah. And you never had that kind of conversation with him
We
before.
had never had that kind of conversation with him before. We had always had kind of a tense relationship, and so that brings some issue, and there are probably people that are going to listen to this that you think about someone who may have taken their life, or maybe you're that person. Our relationship wasn't always smooth as butter. There were those difficult seasons in life, but he was calling me to make it right before he took his life. And he himself asked me some of the questions that I deal with in the book. I know I'm a Christian, but if I commit suicide, will I still be a Christian?
Wow.
Well, that's an easy question to answer because I'm going to the Bible. Then you dig a little deeper, and can you forgive me for where you've been in life and what's taken place? And then you are faced, at least in my circumstance, well, I almost don't want to say yes.
Yeah.
Because if I tell him I forgive him,
that's
permission to do what you're going to do. So, I'm going to put a pause on answering that question. And so we spent a long time, probably my longest conversation on the phone I'd ever had with my brother.
So this wasn't 3 minutes and
it was not
gone.
No, it was not. It was so much so that by the time I'm talking on the phone in the truck, I drive home, I'm talking in the driveway. Finally, my wife, Gina, comes out and she goes, "Are you okay?" And I tell her what's going on. And so, throughout that conversation, I truly felt that we moved to a place where he wasn't going to end his life. He had expressed all the reasons. Marriage is gone. Don't have any friends. Lost my job. I've dug a hole so deep that we can't get out of it. Well, my portion of the response was, we can get you out of the hole. We can put it back together. All of these things are bad things, but there is a future. God still has a future for you.
Yeah.
And, sadly, this is what about took me out of the ministry is when we hung up the phone, I thought I had talked him out of it. And you go lay in your bed, and I live in Dallas. He lives in Houston. In 4 hours, I could have been there. And I thought about it all night. I didn't sleep. Thought about, should I be driving down there? And I didn't. Yeah. And the next day I woke up and I did what I do. I went to the church. And the next phone call I received was from the sheriff's department. And so I will tell you, it changed my life forever. And so when someone walks up to me now, and it just happened Saturday night, went to my high school reunion. It's kind of interesting that when you develop a relationship of having lost a brother to suicide, the word just gets out.
Yeah.
And I had someone walk up to me. I couldn't remember them from my high school reunion, and he just mentioned that his wife took his life, and he just starts crying and hugging.
Wow.
And so there is a fraternity that I don't enjoy being a part of.
Never wanted to be a part of.
It's this one. It's this one.
Wow. And then, like I said, that idea that most preachers talk about, right? God never wastes a hurt. But this is not a hurt you would want to have as a platform for ministry. Ever.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
So you're how many years past this at this point?
Yeah, we're
past the event, not past it, but past the event.
We're now 14 years from it. And as you probably saw, I can still tear up in a nanosecond just telling the story.
Yeah.
Because in some sense, there's a feeling of regret, but also failure.
Right.
That I felt like I failed my brother in that moment, and I will never get that moment back. Right. And that a lot of people deal with that struggle, and that's why I think I needed to write the book.
Yeah. So, and it's kind of like the kind of fundamental responsibility we have for our kids, and then we extend it out to every person that we know and love. My first job is to help this person stay safe.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's my first job. And if I miss that, then I've failed at the most fundamental thing I'm supposed to do in every human relationship that I have. Yep. Right. So this happens. Your book talks a lot about, just the first chapter, the shadow that lasted for years.
Yeah.
So this happens 14 years ago. What happens for you? And, for you have a mom and a sister and obviously other family members. Where does it go in the next few months and the next few years? Our short way to that question is, okay, this happens, and how many years later does the book come? It doesn't come a month later or even a year later. No,
I would say, Mark, there was 3 years that I was walking under a cloud.
Just in a fog.
It was totally a fog. Yeah. That part of what I've always tried to be with my congregation is transparent, and I would stand up and I'd preach on God's grace and His comfort and forgiving yourself and don't live with a guilt trip. And in some respects, I couldn't live out one of those sermons. Mm. And it took me,
which brings a kind of a hypocrisy to it that you feel.
Yep. And I don't like that. And so I literally was thinking about leaving the ministry. I wasn't going to leave church. Right. I was like, I can help somebody else. I can go teach a Sunday school class. I can be a good lay person. I'll be a deacon or something like that. But I just lived under this cloud of guilt, and it almost took me out of ministry. And, I even called one of the guys that still counsels in our church today and told him about it. And he said some gracious words that really relieved a lot of this, which probably led to the book. The first thing he said is, John Mark, I'm a member of the church. I had no idea we're 3 years later that you were still struggling with this as much as you are. Mm. When are you going to stand up in the pulpit and tell me? And I was like, well, a pastor doesn't need to be struggling with this for 3 years down the road, right?
Right. And church is not supposed to be about the pastor.
That's right. It's not about me. It's about everybody else. Yeah. And that took me to a place of praying. And then my wonderful bride encouraged me along the way. She made a statement one night, I'm praying for you. And then she kind of said, we're ready for the old John Mark to come back. Mm. The one that likes to laugh, the one that likes to smile and mean it. Yeah. And between those two things, I developed a series on Habakkuk, and I just shared it all. Mm. And probably the most freeing experience I've ever had. Mm. And didn't mean the pain went away, but I finally told the people I loved that, guys, I felt like a failure. I felt like I let my brother down. I felt like all of these things are who, I've been the last couple of years. And that began to free me up. And as a result, I became known as the one, anybody in the area. I'm a police chaplain with one of the local police departments. Anytime there's a suicide, it was like, call John Mark. And then I'm also kind of saying, hey, don't call me every time because this hurts me too. And I almost wanted to avoid that, but that's where God drew me. And that is, back to your statement, God never wastes a hurt. And I feel like now I can walk into those seasons. I don't like it, but I can look someone in the eyes and not feel like I have to say a thing other than I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Years ago, before my brother took his life, I would feel like I need the right Bible verse or the answer.
Yeah.
The early answer is I'm sorry.
Yeah. And just to stand in it with them.
That's right.
Yeah.
And just be there.
Yeah. So was it, did you just decide to start writing this down as a cathartic experience to try to work your way through it? Was there somebody that said, hey, you need to put this down on paper?
Through the process of me becoming kind of like the pastor that deals with all the suicides, it really came from me having people in my office or meeting them out in the community with them asking the same question over and over again. Okay. Well, first of all, everybody wants to tell you the story because story matters. That's why I start the book with my story.
And that's
the last call.
We just have to process
They
it.
just have to tell the story.
Yeah.
They have to tell the good, the bad, the ups, the downs. They shade the story one way or they shade it the other way. And then you begin to notice some things in their story. Either in their story that they're sharing, there was clearly some contributing factors. My brother would have had those. He isolated himself. He was alone, lost his friendship, lost the love of his life, but also had an addiction problem.
Right. Yeah.
Or you would see other things where it wouldn't be one of these long-term buildup. It would be a 2 or 3 week crisis moment that in that moment, they weren't thinking clearly.
Yeah.
And they took their life. And so you would hear the story, but then a lot of times the very next question would be, are they still in heaven? Can they go to heaven?
Yeah. So let's go down that road, because one of the chapters of your book is, what does the Bible say about suicide? Yeah. And as you said, most frequent question. And like I said, you feel this in the book when you're hearing this part of the story is, your brother's asking this question and he's making statements about forgiveness, and you don't even want to answer them.
Right.
You know what the biblical correct answer is, but you don't want those to be interpreted as permission.
That's right.
And oh, well, now I can do this with freedom, right? But biblically, how would you sum up and just kind of summarize as a place to start? What does the Bible say about suicide?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there is no doubt suicide's a sin. It is murder. It is self-murder. That suicide is a sin. And a lot of times people don't want to hear that or state that, but it is. It is a sin. Now, it's not the unpardonable sin. It's not the one that's going to eliminate a believer, a follower of Christ, from going to heaven, but it is in fact murder. It is sin. It is literally taking what is only God's, in my opinion, biblically, that the number of our days that we have and our breath, and we are taking and ending a life. We're just in suicide, you are ending your own life. So it is a sin, and it is a significant sin. It is a long-term or eternal or permanent solution to oftentimes a temporary problem.
Right.
Or what should be a committed pattern of improvement. I've got to deal with my addiction. I've got to deal with my isolation or loneliness. But, if you go back to the Old Testament, you look through God's Word, suicide's in there. There are clearly 5 instances, maybe 6, depending on how many. Suicide's in the Bible.
Right.
And most of those men are having some struggles in their life. Saul's armor bearer, we don't know anything about him, but that's part of, what you see in the Bible. There were some other incredibly godly people who struggled to the point of despairing of life itself.
Yeah, we think of Elijah particularly, right?
Exactly. What did Elijah do? He ran, got himself physically exhausted, got himself alone in a cave. He began to think, I'm the only one left. And he said, I want to die. And God sent an angel and said, I got an idea. Why don't you realize you're not the only one left? Why don't you go back to where you're supposed to be, surrounded by people, with people, doing what you're called to do, which is a prophet, and follow him on the journey. The next thing he does is he blesses someone right down the road.
Yeah.
And so that's a challenge. The Apostle Paul, of all people, Paul says, man, there was a point, life was so hard. Our travels and journeys were so hard. We even despaired of life itself. Yeah. And
I think he says in that same passage, there's opposition on the outside, fear on the inside. I mean, that's That's kind of sums it all up right there, right?
That's right. And so, the Bible doesn't deny that people committed suicide. They actually recorded. And the Bible also doesn't deny that there are people that you and I would consider certainly more godly than me, Elijah and Paul, who struggled to the point of wanting to die or considering, suicide or death, that ought to challenge us and encourage us to, when someone goes through a moment, a season like that, to be particularly encouraging, but also point to the truth. And back to the original theological question. So the Bible talks about it. Is it the unpardonable sin? Absolutely not.
Yeah, so unpack that a little bit more, but depending upon what branch of the Christian faith you come from, right?
Yeah.
Well, it can't be forgiven because the person obviously can't ask for forgiveness after they've taken their life. Unpack what I would think to be our shared understanding of grace and mercy and salvation, about how we can confidently say this person is forgiven and they are in heaven. How do we come to that in our understanding?
Yeah, and we do realize some people share different theological positions on this, on salvation or eternal security. But, we don't need to really discuss, even our shared faith. What does the Bible say? I always want to go, what does the Bible say in a situation like this? If a person is truly a believer, they've trusted Jesus Christ, they've come to the place where they realize salvation is of God, all of God. Jesus died for all of my sins, was buried in the tomb, rose again the third day. I became a whosoever when I call upon the name of Christ. That puts me in the love of God. Then the Apostle Paul makes it very clear for me. He says, nothing can separate me from the love of God, neither things present or things to come.
Neither life nor death, yeah.
Those two words. So if I am in the love of God, nothing can snatch me or take me away from the love of God, neither things in the present or things to come. Take my brother several years prior to his suicide. He was doing as well as he had ever done. He was not drinking, had a great relationship, as best he could, loved the Lord, went to church, all of those kind of things. Not the perfect Christian, by the way, and had not always been there.
Right.
It was clear to me in that season, in that moment, that he was saved. Okay, so he was in the love of God.
Right.
So neither things present nor things to come could take him away from the love of God, neither death nor life nor anything. So at that point, if he was in God's love, what was left in his life besides things present or things to come? So fast forward a couple of years when things have gone all wrong.
Yeah.
And he makes what I still to this day, I consider it to be the worst decision he could have made. Because not only did it end the opportunity for grace in his life and him to be a testimony for others who walked through the deep, dark valley he did of addiction and loss of a marriage and isolation and loneliness, he never saw the grace on the other side of the mountain. He knows it now.
Right.
But God wasn't finished with him here. But nothing in that moment separating from the love of God. Jesus, what did Jesus say? He says, you're in the palm of my hand and nothing can snatch you from my hand. And not only that, there's a bigger hand than my hand. He says, there's God's hand and no one can snatch you out of God's hand. So once we're in God's hand of grace and love, we can never be taken away.
Right. And then the Bible goes on, Paul and others talk about how we are sealed for the day of redemption, how we may not always feel like it. We may not always act like it, especially in these places of real deep darkness.
That's right.
But it is true, even if we don't feel like it is true. It is true.
That's right.
Because the authority is not with us. It's not even with the strength of our faith. It's with the promise of God and with the love of God that He's articulated in His Word, and we can count on that. Talk a little bit, if you can, just about how even in a church context, you talked a minute ago about story, and when you're talking about how people just need to tell the story, even if they've told it many times, because it's just part of the way that we process grief. It's part of the way that we experience healing. This is kind of advertisement, if you will, for why you need to get back to church if you haven't been in church a while, and particularly be in a small group at church, because I would tell people oftentimes, you need to be in a church, you need to be in a small group at church so that you realize you're not going crazy and you're not the only one. That's a place where you can tell your story as you build relationships of trust and confidence, and you can hear other people's story. And when you're telling your story, it's bringing it out into the light, getting it out of the darkness and into the light. Is that a good way to think about it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And especially, if you're going through something, we need somebody.
Yeah.
So get in church, get in a group, man, you need someone walking through the dark valley. We don't always want to spend the rest of our life in the valley, and we don't want to pretend that valleys aren't deep, and we don't want to pretend that valleys aren't dark. If Solomon, who had all the wealth, all the wisdom, everything you can imagine, you can go down the list, women, he had it all. If Solomon gets to a place where he says, I hate living.
Yeah.
Okay, how much more so can we who are in middle-class America who lose a little? How can we not also acknowledge that we can get to a place where we despair of life? That's why it is so important. God created us as relational beings. And part of the place that God created us for is his kingdom, but also his kingdom on earth. And we can go into that in a different podcast. But the church,
right?
That there is no such thing. You look through the New Testament, there's no encouragement to be a solo Christian where you walk life alone, do life alone. Man, the number of one another's that are found in Scripture are part of who we are when we get together and we can share our story. When someone walks through something like a suicide of a loved one or the loss of a loved one or a divorce or a loss of a child, that being able to tell your story helps you honestly move past it. Because take me for example, for the 3.5 years, I wasn't telling the story.
Yeah, I was going to bring that out as a kind of a really kind of compare and contrast with your brother. One is when he moved into this really deep place of darkness, how he missed that, how he missed being in an environment where he could tell his stories, really not just a story, but his stories of struggle, whether it be with alcohol or with his marriage or with his job. He, somewhere along the way, he wasn't having those conversations with you or apparently anybody else. And then in your book, you talk about in the aftermath of losing him, how the men of your church came to you after, I guess, a period of months and said, hey, we're concerned. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Going back to my brother, you're right. He didn't reach out until it was too late. Yeah. By the time he talked to me, looking back on it now, and called and reached out, it was too late. He should have done it months before.
Yeah.
He should have done it a year before, but he waited until it was too late. So the encouragement to someone here, if they're coming across this and they're in one of those deep, dark valleys, maybe there's a man or a woman that's listening to this or a teenager and you happen to come across this, can I tell you there's no better time to reach out than right now.
Yeah.
Don't let it go too far, because that's problem number one. Is my brother waited until he lost everything before he reached out to someone. So reach out now. Secondly,
it's easy. Think about it. It's easy for us not to want to make those calls or send those texts because we're like, this person just has had years and years and years of struggle, and it's not going to be. It's almost never going to be a fun phone call to call and say, hey, I'm checking on you. Just want to know how you're doing. And a lot of times they're going to have another situation. So it's easy for us that aren't in these dark places to not want to make those calls or send that text, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then so for the survivor, back to your second part of your question, is we had some men in our church that looked at me and said, he's not right. That is not the John Mark that we're used to.
Yeah.
And
how could he be, right?
Yeah. And at that point, I was trying to be the strong pastor. Man, I'm getting through this. I'm going to be an example to the flock, right? And all of these things. I'm never going to share my heart. And one of my deacons at the time just called my wife, Gina, and said, we're coming to get him, have him ready. Okay. And so I went over there, I walked in another house and another bunch of men in the room.
Yeah.
And they said, tell us what's happening. And I just began to talk and share and cry and weep. And they gathered around me and prayed over me and probably enabled me to move on in ministry a little more. That wasn't quite when I shared with the church, but that sure got me through the deepest, darkest part, because in my life was this sense of loss. I've lost my brother.
Yeah.
But failure. I failed as a brother and a pastor, because he was calling his brother and the pastor, asking me theological questions, and I failed at both of them.
Yeah.
And so carrying that, it took men in my life to pull me out of my house and out of my office to say, we're going to go somewhere else, and you're going to share this story with us, and we're going to listen to you as long as you want to share it, and then we're going to gather around you and we're going to pray for you, that God will bless you and give you joy again.
Yeah. Let's go back to just that conversation with your brother, and as you've thought about that, are there specific things, John Mark, that you wish that you had said in that conversation, or things you wish that you had asked? I was reading another book that I mentioned to you on this topic called Hope Always, and part of that book, he says, hey, if you're talking to somebody that's in this real deep place of darkness, he used the word halt as a way of remembering, hey, try to talk to this person and help them to get clarity around, are you hungry? Are you just physically hungry and depleted? Are you angry? Are you lonely? Are you tired? Because those things start to become themes that you often hear in these stories, right? This person's not physically well. They're not eating. They're not sleeping in a regular pattern. I've had several people in my ministry, in my church, that I had a young man in his 20s off at college, just literally lost touch with reality and was found walking through a city park in a major town with almost no clothes on. And this guy he's knocking it out academically, but he went so long without eating and without sleeping in a healthy way, he basically lost touch with reality. And the only reason he didn't end up in a county jail is because the officers he was walking through this town predicting violence and the end of the world and all of these kinds of things. But the officers fortunately realized that he was having a mental psychotic issue, took him to a mental hospital as opposed to the jail. But we sometimes forget that we're holistic beings, and that if we're not eating right, if we're not sleeping right, if you mentioned your brother's living out in the country, being isolated and lonely, if we're angry about, perhaps in your brother's case, losing his job, losing his wife, those things just kind of compound together. When you look back on it, you look back on that conversation, or even how you related to him over a period of months or whatever, are there other things you wish you had put in that conversation? And kind of leading up to the question, do you think it's good at some point to say, hey, are you thinking about hurting yourself?
I think that is a valid question. In my particular conversation, there was no doubt, because he made it.
He was already telling you.
He was telling me, this is my goodbye phone call. And so, but going back to, had he not, there is no doubt in my mind that at some point, the way he was talking to me, I would have said, are you thinking about committing suicide? And I would have been open. I will tell you that more and more as I've studied this, I am actually more abrasive, and I use the word abrasive for a reason. Because there is nothing glamorous about suicide. And particularly within the young people, a lot of times who are struggling, they'll think, well, there's going to be a candlelight vigil for me or something. Let me tell you what, there is nothing pretty about suicide. That it needs to be called what it is. It is murder. It is self-murder.
Nothing noble.
There's nothing noble about it. It destroys everybody that you say you love. And so I just want to tell you that. And I say that knowing that my brother, the reason why he told me goodbye is he didn't want to hurt me. But what he did is almost destroyed me.
Right.
And I know the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, and that phone call almost destroyed me. That was not his heartbeat. So if there's someone out there struggling right now, I want them to know that that this hurts others. And if you're someone like me who you're wondering if someone is considering it, ask the question. Are you just something like, are you telling me you're considering committed suicide? And there needs to be some shock value
to that statement.
Yeah. Don't let them, build this, this fluffy version of suicide that is not a real picture of what's going on. So going back to my brother's phone call, what I wish I'd have done is, looking back now, is hung up and called 911 immediately. But like I said, I truly thought I had talked him out of it.
Right.
I didn't think there was going to be much value in sending the police over there that night because of who my brother was and that he was drunk in that moment in that season. But, to be more direct, it was clear for me. Others, if they're talking to someone, they're having a question, or are they talking about suicide? I would encourage you just ask.
Yeah. Because it used to be, from some of the reading I've done recently along this topic, is that it used to be that people would say, well, I'm not going to ask that kind of a question. Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you thinking about committing suicide? Because that might give them the idea so that kind of has been debunked. And then tell me if you've run into this as well, that maybe the next question, if the person says, yes, I am thinking in that way, or I've had those thoughts, that a good next kind of question to ask the person is, do you have a plan?
Yeah.
Was your brother articulating any kind of specifics relative to a plan that night?
No, he was just very, very declarative.
Right.
This is over. I want you to know I love you. I ask your forgiveness. Am I still going to heaven?
Right.
That was my brother. And so he didn't tell me a specific plan. There was no doubt in my life, knowing my brother, that he could have chosen numerous ways and been successful.
Right.
So that was not the debate in my life, but that is the follow-up plan. First of all, you just mentioned it. If you ask someone if they're going to hurt themselves, I will promise you are not going to plant the idea.
It's already there.
If they're thinking about hurting themselves, the idea is already there. If they're not, you have not planted something they're not going to all of a sudden embrace and think about. Suicide has never been something that I've contemplated, thought about. Could there be something in life events that bring me to even think about it? I don't think so, right? But you asking me, Mark, if you ever see me down someday and say, man, are you okay, John Mark? You're not going to plant something in my mind.
Right.
But then the second idea is take it a step forward and say, have you planned this?
Yeah.
Because here's what we know. If they've done those two things, you need to take this extremely serious. Yeah. If they've thought about harming themselves and they're putting a plan into place, you better address them. That is not the time to beat around the bush.
Yeah, and I like what you said a minute ago about calling 911.
Yep.
And because I have in my pastoral role had that happen to me, and a family member would call, hey, I'm concerned. They seem really dark. They've said this to me, but I don't know if they're serious. And I said, you always take it serious, and you always call. Even if you think it's a bluff for attention, that you always call the bluff. You call 911 because if somebody was doing this for attention, it's, in my opinion, the cruelest thing you can do to somebody else is to play with this kind of language and to put it out there. And so what I've said is, look, if it was only a bluff, it would be the most cruel kind of emotional, relational manipulation. So call the bluff. And I've gone to families and said, look, I'm telling you, call 911, or I'm going to, now that you've brought me into the conversation, and I'm going to come stand there with you. And it's not going to be fun. The police department is going to show up and they're going to talk to this individual. And most likely, about 99% of the time, to be on the safest side, they're going to take this person and they're going to take them for an evaluation. And they're probably going to be mad about that, especially if they were doing this just for attention. But this is absolutely the case where you err on the side of caution, far on that side, right?
Absolutely. Well, and you know, should something happen to them anyway, you're going to live the rest of your life with somewhat of regret. All right. So from here on out, if someone makes that suggestion to me in a phone call, I will stop them mid-conversation and say, are you telling me that you're considering this, that you're doing this? And I've been in my office meeting with somebody, and if they typically will begin to back out of it,
Right.
And reverse that. Okay, because I want you to know I'm about to go call 911 if this is what you're truly contemplating and thinking about it. And you do encourage others as well. But beyond that, the issue of suicide has such a devastating impact on everybody around the person who took their life that we have to see it as an important conversation to have because it is so devastating.
Right. And and like I said, the ramifications are so deep. Talk a little bit about your book. You mentioned the concern that many have written about and continue to write about the rising rates of suicide. Before we started recording, I told you a story I just came across in the last couple of days, that there was a veteran in Canada who was in a really dark place, and he called the National Canadian Hotline looking for help. And part of the worldview he got back was he actually got some counsel from the person on the other end of the phone who was supposed to be helping him about medically assisted suicide. And so that worldview is growing up around us to where this idea of we each have the right about whether or not we're going to continue or end our life, which is absolutely a godless point of view in our opinion, in our view from an understanding of Scripture. But it is this kind of romantic idea is growing up in our culture, and our young people are being exposed to it. What are some of the things you're seeing? What do you learn about how suicide and the idea of suicide is being put in front of young people especially?
Yeah, and even the draw you mentioned early on of the levels of hopelessness and despair and anxiety and depression that are rising in our young people. And, they've always been there.
Right.
But there's no doubt statistically that they're on the rise. And part of that is that we've taken an important dimension of who we are out of a lot of what students do. Hey, the truth is when a kid goes through 12 to 18 years old, whether they're male or female, those are weird seasons in life.
Yeah, very challenging.
You are already looking to compare yourself to, who can run faster, who can jump higher, whatever it is, who's smarter. Now what happens is we get to a place where more and more kids are not relating to people, but they are relating to machines who are connected to other people.
Right.
Which is not in and of itself an actual relationship. And then you add to that another level is when you get people who are only peers communicating with themselves who are also peers, and you don't have a multi-generational communication into a group of young people or a young person, then it's just a recipe for disaster. Okay. So to move beyond some of this hopelessness and despair is we've got to get our kids back into relationships. That's how God has created us. Okay. Social media is here to stay, but parents need to limit it. They do. And I don't want to be the stick in the mud here, but they need to limit it. Online gaming, it's a thing, but parents better limit it. Right. Because those are not real relationships with people. It's not getting someone up and out. And the more the studies are so clear, the more a person is on social media, the more a person is online, hopelessness, depression, discouragement, anxiety go up. They don't go down.
Right.
They're never fixed.
And we're seeing some crazy numbers where I think what we call Gen Z, people between the ages of 10 and 25, on average, are spending somewhere between 4 and 8 hours a day, not related to school, not related to anything, just discretionary time through their screen, relating in some ways to people, but doing it through algorithms and through machines, right?
That's exactly right.
And I know from my own experience, I never feel better about myself after being on social media. Never.
Ever.
But it becomes an addiction, especially and even some of these Gen Z's folks have described it as an addiction. Like, hey, I know I should put the phone away. I know I should put the iPad away. I just can't do it. It just keeps drawing me in. But the statistics are alarming that this generation is more likely to harm themselves than to be the victim of harm from somebody else. And it's being drawn and driven in them, a lot of it by these pseudo relationships.
That's right. And you take, for instance, and this is the encouragement for the parent out there or to the parent. Take the two of us, right? Okay, we're in the ministry. We matured long before social media was a thing.
Right.
We matured long before a phone that you could carry with you was a thing. I hate to admit that about myself. But still, when we post something on social media, it doesn't define who I am, but I will guarantee you I still look and see how many likes I got.
Right.
Yeah. I do.
Yeah.
And Mark, I always look at you and you get way more likes than I do, which always makes me kind of bitter.
Well, it must be some other person with a name like mine.
But you understand what I'm saying. We
Sure.
are two people who are totally confident in who we are. Our identity is settled. It is in Christ. I don't live by social media. If you want to follow me, follow me. I'm going to post some things because I'm a pastor of the church, all right? I want you to know a little bit about my family. But if all of those things, if none of those things drive me, but I can't go to social media without looking how many likes I got,
right?
And every once in a while I'll look at some other pastor dude like you and I go, well, look at there. How do we expect our 12 to 18-year-olds to mature emotionally when they have a tool that draws them away from good relationships where real people will affirm them and mom and dad or grandma and grandpa can speak wisdom into their life? The best thing that ever can happen to them from time to time is to have to leave their room and realize this too shall pass.
Yeah. And like you said, we need to do some really fresh thinking about how to get them into multi-generational environments. And actually, some of the research we've done recently here at the Denison Forum reveals that they want that. They're looking for heroes, but they don't know how to find them. And a good advertisement for why you need to take your kids to church.
Yeah.
Why you need to encourage them to be involved in various activities. Why you even simply need to. Why the best reason to go to a family reunion, perhaps, is to get your child, your teenager, around other generations, people who are both younger and older than them, and get them out of what might be really tight echo chambers, to where they're just hearing the thinking of their own peers, or sometimes it's not even their peers. It's people that are actually, most likely environment where a teen could be victimized by predators through a digital experience right now. That's where most of those conversations are starting in chat rooms and that type of thing. Heard one expert in this field say, you know what, I don't care what you do. I don't care what you do. Just get your preteen, your child, your teenager, and go do anything that doesn't involve a screen.
Yeah.
Just go do anything that doesn't involve a screen, and you're improving their day-to-day existence by doing that, right? Some suggestions you might have about how do you get young people into multi-generational environments and conversations?
Yeah. Well, you've got to be intentional. And, intentional is a word that's overused. Intentional is a word that's overused and underutilized.
Right.
That we got to be intentional about it. Well, first of all, at Cottonwood Creek, we've made a shift that we are now bringing students into our worship. We want them to see different generations.
As opposed to having their own small
thing.
group
And we're
time,
not
their own worship
opposed
time, and all of that.
their own thing, their small groups. We still do all that. But we also have one time on Sunday where everybody gets together. All the generations get together. So we've made an intentional choice. That's not an easy choice because it was already hard enough. Take music, for example. Everybody loves the preaching, right, Mark?
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've heard that over and over again.
Over again.
At your church.
For all of your years. No, I was talking about your church, that all those years. But here's the reality. It's hard enough to get music that people like if you don't have the students in the room. Now I had the students in the room and now try to get music that people like. But you still got to be intentional. It's worth it. It's worth it for us to see. It also challenges me as someone who, I don't have grandkids, but I now have 3 married parents, that I better be a little more crisp and engaging because now I'm not preaching to a bunch of mature adults who can tune me out. There are 6th through 8th graders and 6th through 12th graders or 9th through 12th graders that are sitting right over there depending on which hour we're in. I've got to be engaging of them, and I've got to draw their attention and keep their attention. That's on me. So guess what? I better work hard. So I am now adding that to my sermon prep time is how am I going to engage that middle schooler at 1 hour, that high schooler at the next hour? It's intentional and it's hard, but we need to do it. The next thing, as you mentioned, moms and dads just flat out need to get their kids to do anything and everything. Next thing is you need to, as a parent who's going to lead their child, you need to make sure kids come to church. And their answer is going to be, well, my friends aren't there. That may or may not be true.
Right.
But how do you create friends?
No.
It's wherever you go, you are going to create friends. And the truth is we have allowed the world that we live in to supplant the idea that a digital friend is an actual friend when they are not actual friends.
Yeah.
Physical friends are the only ones that can create the emotional stability, the strength, and the support we need. And as we're thinking about the idea of suicide, here's the answer. For the person who was like my brother, the most important thing he needed was to go to church.
No.
Okay, and I'm saying church because I'm a pastor, but to go be with groups. He stayed isolated alone. Addiction took over, crazy, okay. So I believe had he been going to church, he would have made a different decision. Absolutely, because I'd seen him make that decision before.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. When was that? He was in church. He was with relationships. He was with people, and he was doing well. Yeah. That didn't mean he wouldn't have a time when he would drink again. Now, for people who have lost a loved one, what do they need more than anything? Not to be isolated, not to be alone, be around someone else, encourage them and lift them up. Here's the beauty of the way God created us and God created the church, is the answer to both is found in one place.
Yeah.
It's another collection of broken people who are being Christ in each other's lives.
Yeah, and we need to recognize that one of the fundamental strategies of the devil is to get us off by ourselves and to keep us isolated, keep us away from God and away from each other. That's a fundamental strategy that is always there with him, right? And just thinking about this, when you were talking about this in your book about multi-generational relationships, it reminded me of some meetings I've been in recently, but it also reminded me of a guy named Ted Walters. As far as I know, I probably wrong about this, but when I was a teenager, I met Ted Walters. Ted Walters ran a gas station in our town, okay? When I got a little bit older and I got a part-time job, I delivered oil and other products to his gas station. But that's not where I first got to know him. I came to Christ in my teenage years. I came into this church, and Ted Walters would just be in the environment of the youth department on Sunday morning, he and his wife. And I never had him as a Sunday school teacher. I don't even know if he's taught Sunday school. He just hung out in there. And when we went off to summer camp, Ted and his wife went to summer camp with us, and never heard him teach a lesson, never heard him pick up a Bible or anything like that, except in one-on-one conversation. But he just simply showed up at our activities, and he and his wife just built relationships of caring connection to people who were 2 generations behind them, right? And it was just one of those things. There was just this concert of people. Some of them actually taught us Bible study, or others of them ran a game that we might do at summer camp, but others just were there. They'd sit down with you when it was mealtime and, hey, tell me about you, and just have a conversation. There's a guy in heaven now, a guy named Tom Lawson, he was a deacon at our church, and every single Sunday he walked over to where there would be a group of teenagers talking, and he'd just introduce himself or reintroduce himself to everybody in that group. And he was just simply building a relation. And you know what? Anybody can do that. We talk about building friendly churches. People aren't looking for friendly churches. They're looking for friends. Yeah. And they're even looking for multi-generational friends.
That's right.
And I never really engaged it or needed to engage it at that moment. I knew if I needed to or wanted to, I could go over and say to Mr. Lawson, hey, could we talk for a few minutes? Could we go to have lunch? And he would have been totally ready to do that. And, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, well, what could I do? I don't really want to volunteer to teach 7th graders. Okay, you and I would understand why a lot of people wouldn't want to volunteer to teach 7th graders. But you could go hang out with them, endure a little bit of their music, look past their current fashion style, and just get to know their story, right? That's one of the beauties of church.
It's all about that. And the truth be told, for all of us, if make me a middle school, high schooler, guess what I want right now? I want a phone.
Yeah.
Okay, if you take me, so we can sit here and talk all these kids on our phone, we'd have been just like them, right?
Yep.
And if there's someone out here listening to this, 70, 80 years old, you want to talk about how they dress and what they do, and they wear hats in church and all of those kind of things. Hey, listen, if you were growing up today, you'd be doing the same thing, all right? Yeah. You are who you are because of where you've been. And they are where we've been. It's just a different world, different culture. And so you referenced something that just, the oldest trick in the book is Satan wants to get us away from people in church. That's what happened in the garden. What Adam and Eve hid from God.
Yeah.
So whatever, if there's someone out there, you're going through some stuff, maybe you're like my brother, you've been through some stuff. And if you're in a place of hiding from God, I think God still asks the same question, where are you? And, and so I want to draw the person out that is struggling with depression and struggle. God's saying, where are you? Come back to church, be a part of who it is. Life isn't going to be perfect, but God can use you in a powerful and real way.
Yeah, unpack that a little bit more, because your book, you talk about this, and somebody listening to this podcast right now is listening to this podcast because they saw the title of it.
Yeah.
And they're thinking about, they've got a teenager in their house or in their life. They got a coworker. They have somebody that they're worried about, and they're wondering, what should I do next? What should be the next conversation? What should be my next move? Yeah. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say be boldly honest with them. If you truly, especially if they're your student or someone at work, is be boldly honest with them. Then you can also acknowledge that if there is an addiction problem, because like with my brother, I wasn't going to fix his addiction.
No.
I could have a conversation. I could help him find the right space. And then you need to bring in professionals. There are professionals that can have conversations with people. If it's someone at work, I guarantee you your work probably has access to some sort of counselors. And so you don't have to be the expert in this situation. You need to pave the way for that person to go to the expert.
Right.
And so that's one of the things. Just relieve yourself from doing the very basics, which is have a bold conversation with someone. If they're a student, if they're one of your children, if it's a spouse, if it's a brother or sister or someone you love, have a bold conversation with them, and figure out how can I get them to the professionals. And then if you walk down that path, don't be afraid to go to a professional.
Yeah. And go with them, right?
Yeah, go with them.
Yeah. I mean, and it's never, no matter what my role was, whether it was as a friend or as a pastor, this is never an enjoyable road to walk with somebody.
Yeah.
Right? How could it be? Nobody likes confronting things of anxiety and depression and addiction, and life is really, really messy in those places. One of my more recent experiences, I had a guy call me. He said, "Look, I don't feel like I can talk to anybody. Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." I knew him, but I didn't know him well. And by the end of that conversation, he said, "Hey, I have enough awareness of myself to know that I've been in dark places before, and I might be going there again. Would you be willing to take my firearms?" And I'm like, I don't. So I meet this guy and his wife in the grocery store parking lot, and they asked me to steward his firearms. And then the next thing he said, "Would you take me? We've talked, and we need to go. Feel like I need to go to this facility and talk to these professionals, but I can't drive myself. Would you be willing to go?" I was like, that wasn't what I planned to do with my day, but how could I do anything better than that? Right. And so, I was willing to do that, even though it's awkward, it's clumsy, it's scary. You never quite know what your footing is. But if you're with that person and you're doing all that you know to do, to be bold, to be honest, to be intentional, and to help them move toward the kind of people and experiences that will help them out of that darkness, what could be better for the way that you would spend that day or your time, right?
No, and that's the same way, whether you're spending a day or an hour with someone or just a phone call with someone. This is where anyone listening to this needs to understand, when it comes to suicide, every conversation is going to be awkward. There is no specific path to having a great conversation with someone who is contemplating suicide. It is an awkward conversation because you don't have any idea what's coming at you.
Right.
For those who have been through suicide, you can look through the way the person takes their life can be vastly and wildly different. Take my brother's case. He was trying to make it as easy on me as possible. He was not sticking it to me.
Right.
It crushed my spirit.
Yeah.
There are some people that they can be at the other end of the spectrum where the person really in a vindictive way took
trying to hurt
even more.
Right.
And so, man, if you take two people who are thinking about suicide and put one into that spectrum, one in the other, then now all of a sudden take 6 months before they took their life, enter into a conversation with those two people. It's awkward. There is no formula for the answer, but for how this conversation goes. But the most important thing is, are you willing to have that awkward conversation and get them to the help that they need? Because, we can't be quiet about this subject. Yeah. It's not going away. It's getting worse.
Yeah. I got one last question for you so you can finish up. But while you're thinking, so here's my question, and then I'm gonna fill a little bit so you have time to think about it. What's one or two things about you, having gone through this journey over the last 15 years? What are the one or two things that are different and are likely permanently different in you because of this journey that you've had with your brother? And here's the opportunity I'm going to give to fill a little bit of time. Number one is we want you to remember and share the number everywhere you have the opportunity, 988. If you don't have anybody else to talk to, 988, you can get to the National Suicide Hotline. Caring churches in every community, those are great opportunities. I also, just as we were talking, I wouldn't go too far out on this limb yet, but the comparison between Peter and Judas, perhaps the most famous, no question, the most famous suicide or well-known suicide in the Bible is Judas after he betrayed Jesus. But Peter fails in very big ways as well, fails to acknowledge his relationship with Jesus 3 times in the night that he's crucified. We know the difference. Judas goes out, isolated, takes his own life. Peter is restored. John 21, just reading it this morning. Peter gets restored after Jesus is resurrected. I wonder if the difference is, or at least one of the big differences is that Peter stayed around the other believers. He was as confused. He was more feeling like a failure than any other probably. But compared to Judas, he stays in the company of the people who are grieving and confused because of Jesus' crucifixion and everything, but he stays in that group, whereas Judas apparently goes off by himself. There's a story, there's a message in there for us in some powerful ways. John Mark, what's different about you now? What's permanently different about you, both good and bad, perhaps, one of each or whatever, however you want to frame that?
No, I can think of 2 off the top of my head, and they both relate to this subject. One is sadly, but also gladly, because of the hurt and the pain I went through, I think I'm a better pastor. You put me in a moment in a season, there could have been years ago when things were going well that I could have been a little cold and callous that, hey, let's just do this and we're all going to be fine.
Yeah.
Right. So I really think it's made me a better pastor. And I believe that if there's someone that's listening to this podcast right now, that even if you're in still a sense of pain and hurt, I just want you to know, listen to this pod. I can't tell my brother's story without crying now.
No.
And so whatever you're going through, God can use this hurt, the heartache of losing a loved one, to make you a better person. So I am clearly a better pastor. It took me a while to get there. I'm a slow learner, several years. The second thing, Mark, and I will tell you, I believe this as much as anything. Had my brother made a different decision to not end his life, God would have blessed him and used him in a powerful and a real way.
No.
And I believe that now more than I did the day after he took his life or the week after he took his life, that there are biblical examples of it, but I truly believe, and if there's someone right now listening to this podcast and you're thinking about it, those are two things that changed me. I'm a better pastor because of brokenness I went to, but number two, I'm more convinced than ever that my brother made the wrong choice. And whoever's contemplating suicide right now, if you do it, you are making the wrong choice. God still has a plan for you, and God still wants to use you.
What a good word. The book is Last Call, Suicide and Unfinished Life, John Mark Caton. You can find it on all of the major book distributors. And John Mark, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your story with us. And we hope that this will be helpful to you and to others. Please share the podcast with others. Remember, Suicide Hotline is now 988 if you ever need that resource. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Denison Forum Podcast. God bless you. We'll see you soon.